What's your current evaluation, assessment of what's going on in Gaza? Are we gonna have some sort of off ramps?
It's very precarious. Thank God for the ceasefire, the truce that has occurred these last several days. It's been a respite for those of us outside of Gaza, and this means nothing compared to their suffering. But that we have not seen the videos and the photos of that slaughter daily like we did for 7 weeks, where every day we were looking at photos and videos that we never want to see, things that we wish we had not seen. And if this ceasefire, this truce, if these negotiations fail, and I'm grateful, and many people are, for the work the Qataris are doing to try and implement this. But if it fails, the slaughter, the ethnic cleansing, the massacre will begin again. And there are plenty, of course, in the Israeli government who want it to continue. Just before I began talking with you, I saw a tweet from Itamar Ben-Gvir, the far-right Israeli Minister for National Security, who said a very simple tweet. He said, ceasefire equals dissolution of the government. So the precarious nature of this, the powers that want to see the killing going on, the campaign begin again, the continuation of the ethnic cleansing, as well as the continuation of vengeance. There certainly are those, both Israeli and American, who say that the purpose of this is the eradication of Hamas, and either they are just dumb and ignorant and don't understand these sorts of things and didn't pay attention for the last 20 some odd years of the American empire and its wars in the Muslim world, but as well as the whole of history, as well as the whole concept of, like, if you were in a situation, if you were in the Palestinian or the Gazan situation, what would you do? So either they're too dumb or ignorant to understand that, or they know and they just choose to lie. They choose to say something that sounds agreeable, that sounds not quite as cold-blooded and ruthless, that hides their hatred and their desire for violence. This idea that somehow the eradication of Hamas is going to occur through military force, where everything we know, all of our experiences, what history teaches us, is that the results are going to be that you're going to have a stronger base of support for Hamas among the Palestinians, that they're going to deepen their relationship with other organizations, other nations throughout the region and the world. And also, very dangerously, that whatever succeeds Hamas, say you are able to burn all their banners and pull down all their signs, and there's a name change where you have some type of Hamas version 2.0, what you're going to get is something more extreme. We have seen this in our lifetimes. We've seen this all throughout history. And so this idea that somehow the purpose is to eradicate Hamas is just complete. It's a lie. It's folly. And it is completely counterproductive. That's what your true goal is. But ultimately, what we're seeing here is desire in the Israeli campaign, desire for vengeance, as well as for a continuation of the 100-year campaign of ethnic cleansing against the Palestinians. So we're at the situation where we have been fortunate to have seen and witnessed a 4-day truce. It's been extended, and hopefully that truce will be further extended. There'll be further prisoner swaps. But most importantly, these negotiations that are being conducted by the Qataris between Israel and Hamas leads to some type of long-term permanent ceasefire that, of course, leads to some type of actual political solution to the occupation and end of the occupation specifically, but some type of political solution to the Palestinian grievances, ultimately a Palestinian state. But what we're seeing, though, coming from the Israelis, is that it doesn't seem likely that such a thing is possible. The history of the last 70 years tells us that such a thing is possible. The history since 1967 tells us, history since 1993, since 2001, 2002, on and on and on, tells us that it's not possible. So, I mean, the situation is very desperate for the people of Gaza. You're hearing reports now that the outbreaks of disease, the chronic malnutrition and starvation, the lack of clean water is starting to show. You're starting to see the beginnings of widespread disease, as well as the fact that we are entering into, they are entering into the colder part of the year. You can just see this looking at videos from Gaza, where you see the people dressed with warmer clothes, with blankets around them, because it is getting into a colder, wetter period of year. So the catastrophe we have witnessed, if it begins again, may even be made worse by the circumstances becoming more and more dire and more severe. And so the necessity of the Qataris being successful, and that, of course, leads to the conversation of what are the Americans doing? And with all the leverage we have over Israel, and we can argue about who is more leveraged, the Israeli lobby on the American Congress. But the reality is that Israel could not be conducting this campaign in Gaza without the direct support of the United States, whether it be political, media, diplomatic, economic, military, logistics, intelligence, all that type of support. Without that, they cannot do what they're doing. And so the leverage that the U.S. has over Israel is immense. And the fact that it's not being utilized to ensure that this thing does not begin again is a great shame. But the reality of who the Israeli government is, the pressure they are under, and the fact that they have come so far in terms of their hardliners, their far right, being ensconced in their government, controlling their government, and of course, as Ben-Gvir was saying today, being the linchpin for the government, makes the reality that this thing is going to begin again at the end of the week a very real possibility.
Why they are trying to physically remove them instead of go after more intelligent solutions?
The Israeli campaign against Hamas has not been militarily effective. Yes, they have rubbled and destroyed large parts of Gaza, particularly northern Gaza, where half the buildings have been destroyed, 15,000 targets, as they call them. So at least 15,000 buildings hit with bombs. So you can make the argument just by the amount of bombs being dropped, if you want to try and make this argument, that they are being military successful. So just the metrics, it's the fact that you're dropping bombs somehow equates to success. We have a lot of people in the U.S., particularly in the U.S. military and U.S. government, who see things that way. These are the people who thought we were winning in Iraq, who thought we were winning in Afghanistan because of how much money we were spending, how many bombs we were dropping, how many troops we had in the ground. Those kind of metrics to them were an assessment of how well we were performing. And that's just, it's idiotic. But the idea that there has been a military effect on Hamas in the sense of degrading it or destroying it just has not happened. And I can't remember which source it was. It was the Washington Post or the New York Times or the Wall Street Journal. One of them in the last week or so, talking about how the estimates are that 1,000 to 2,000 Hamas fighters have been killed in the last 7 weeks. I mean, so that just, out of a force estimated to be 30,000. Meanwhile, you've killed at least 15,000, wounded well over 30,000, made homeless 70-75% of the population, destroyed the entire infrastructure, on and on and on. So if you look at that, how can you say that we were targeting Hamas when you did almost very little damage, when you did none, but very little damage to Hamas? And meanwhile, you have destroyed an entire population. But then that gets to the point of what the campaign is. What are the goals? What are they trying to achieve? And certainly it's not the eradication of Hamas. It is vengeance, and it is the continuation of ethnic cleansing campaign. If you want to attack Hamas, Hamas exists primarily as an idea. They have a constituency. They have a purpose. They are validated by the occupation. It's in their name. They are the Islamic resistance movement. And there we can certainly get into all the relationship that Hamas has had with the Israeli government, including recently. You've got that quote people have probably seen where, I think it was from 2019, Benjamin Netanyahu says, the best way to, I'm going to paraphrase it, but the best way to ensure there is no Palestinian state is to support organizations like Hamas. right? So the Israelis, as a matter of policy for decades, were putting their weight, putting their money, literal money, behind Hamas and other violent Palestinian resistance groups, because that would give the Israelis the all the reason they needed not to enter into good faith negotiations with the Palestinians, as well as to crack down, to have a harsher occupation, to try and snuff out any resistance, right? That gave them the reason to use the, an iron fist or an iron glove as opposed to a velvet glove, right? So, you want to attack Hamas, you want to undercut them, you want to undermine them, you want to delegitimize them, take away their reason for being. And that would involve ending the occupation. That would involve addressing Palestinian grievances. That would involve ensuring civil and human rights for all people, in Israel and Palestine. That would mean, of course, then too, a Palestinian state, whether it's as some part of one state solution, a confederation, a two-state solution. I'm not sure. That would be up for them to decide, but certainly some state that has all the trappings and semblance of a state. So it has control over its borders. It has an airport. It has its own armed forces and security forces. It has control of its natural resources, including its water. One of the things, not to get on a tangent about, but you will hear from various people who are arguing that the Palestinians have been giving opportunities and they've denied them. They will point to various deals put forward by whether it be Bill Clinton, whether it be by George W. Bush, whoever, in terms of solutions to the Palestinian issues, to provide for a two-state solution. And you look at these things and they're just terrible, terrible deals. No one would accept them. The example I was getting at was the fact that underneath these deals, that the ones that are pointed to as shown that the Palestinians have had this chance for peace and they've walked away for it. Well, under those deals, the Israelis would have retained 85% of the water in a Palestinian state. I mean, so anything that comes has to involve that type of guarantee that the Palestinians will have actual sovereignty. So getting back to your question about Hamas, then, is that's how you eradicate Hamas. That's how you undercut them. That's how you take away their legitimacy, is by addressing these grievances. It's also the way that you actually achieve security for Israel, because for as long as you have an occupation, there will be no security for Israel. Israeli citizens, far less than Palestinians, of course, but Israelis will continue to be killed for years to come by Palestinian resistance groups because of the occupation. So if you want to make Israel safe and secure for Israelis, take away the occupation. But that, of course, runs counter to much of the power structure within Israel, which has been taken over and dominated. I shouldn't say taken over, because it's always been present. I mean, this is, again, an ethnic cleansing campaign that predates the state of Israel. But certainly, say, in the last decade or so, as the Israeli government has gotten more right-wing, as you have seen people like Itamar Ben-Gvir, Bezalel Smotrich come into the cabinet, you have an ideological hardline mentality that dominates all the decision making. So your chances of negotiation, I think, are probably at their furthest, unfortunately, than they have been in much, in a very long time.
We don't have, as in Ukraine, we didn't have any type of debate on the both sides of the aisle. How do you see it right now in this case? Do you see any communication?
Well, certainly what we've seen in the last week or two in the Qataris delivering this truce and prisoner swap, and then the extension of it, the trust that's being built, one that completely belies the assertions that you can't talk to Hamas. I mean, you couldn't turn on a television or read the newspaper or got on Twitter or whatever in the last 7 weeks and not seen the assertions from all the experts, all the pundits, all the former generals and diplomats, all the folks on CNN and Fox and MSNBC, BBC, wherever, asserting that you can't talk to Hamas. You can't trust them. They will violate any deal. And yeah, Hamas has violated ceasefires in the past, and so have the Israelis. And here you have a clear evidence, though, that those people, again, don't know what they're talking about, or they're lying. And we have seen this over and over and over again. We were told the North Vietnamese could not be talked to. We were told the Soviet Union could not be talked to. Norman Solomon wrote an essay in the last week or so for The Nation magazine on the need for renewed arms control talks with the Russians. And it's a great essay. But he talks about in the 1980s when the Soviet Union was first beginning, when Mikhail Gorbachev especially was first beginning to talk to the United States, to Ronald Reagan, about arms control, about how the American news networks, everything that just used the word propaganda over and over and over again. Norman points out that in one piece about the Soviets unilaterally ending their nuclear testing, CBS News, Leslie Stahl, who was a longtime journalist in the United States, used the word propaganda 4 times in describing the Soviet overture to end nuclear testing. And they had done it. The same thing, too. And Norman brings up another, Dan Rather, anchor for CBS News, same thing. As Gorbachev is reaching out to the U.S. to try and get some degree of arms control, and thank God Ronald Reagan accepted and went in with them, because there's a lot of pressure on Reagan not to do so. And what was Reagan being told? Why he was being belittled, why he was being demeaned from his own party, particularly, was the fact he couldn't trust the Soviets. You're naive, you're foolish. They, and they would, and so on and so forth. And then, you saw that we, told over and over again, you can't talk to the Iraqi insurgency. You can't talk to the Taliban. This is where my personal experiences came into, because I saw both those things. I witnessed them. I saw how we did speak to the Iraqi insurgency after more than 3 years of having occupied Iraq, waged this brutal occupation against the Sunnis in particular. We're told over and over again, you can't speak with the Sunni insurgency. Once we spoke to them, within a matter of months, the Sunni insurgency was gone. Talking about what happened in 2006, 2007. The same with, say, the Afghan Taliban. We were told over and over again, they don't want to talk. They're not willing to talk. And what they want to do is talk. When I was in Afghanistan with the State Department in 2009, it's one of the reasons why I resigned, was the fact that twice I had Taliban interlocutors come in and talk to us, wanting to talk, wanting to negotiate. And of course, the instructions from the U.S. Embassy, which were instructions from the White House, basically, were, we are not talking. I can get into that whole story, but basically, the lie was that they won't talk. You can't trust them. They're not interested in talking. Military victory is the only thing that is possible, and that's been shown to be a lie over and over and over again. I mean, look what happened, say with Ukraine, where the Russians tried to negotiate before they invaded. They tried to negotiate in the days and weeks after they invaded, and we've seen more and more evidence come out, more and more documentation, including most recently the head of the Ukrainian delegation that was talking to the Russians in the first weeks of the war, where they had a draft peace plan in place, and then the West came in, the Americans and the British came in and said, no, you're not signing this peace deal with the Russians. We're going to fight this, and we're going to win, because only military victory is possible. That's all we want. A lot of it comes back to domestic political politics, domestic political pressure, but it's something we have heard over and over and over again, and we have all seen it be not true. All the evidence we have is that, dialogue works, right? Which is the name of your show, which is completely apt and totally correct. And what runs against the grain, though, of not just our militarized foreign policy, but our militarized media and our militarized political system.
During Soviet Union, there was the Russian studies in the United States. Everybody who was working with Soviet Union, he was studying all those issues in details. Right now in the Middle East, you talk about Iraq, Afghanistan. We had Al-Qaeda. After that, we have ISIS. These groups are getting worse and worse. It seems that there is no serious studies in institutions about these issues. Do we have any sector responsible for these type of studies in the Biden administration?
Certainly, you have career diplomats, career spies, analysts, military officers who understand not just the immorality of what's occurring in Gaza and Palestine, but the futility of it and how counterproductive it is. That whatever comes out of this is going to be more extreme. That this type of oppression, this subjugation, breeds resistance, and the more brutal it gets, the more extreme the resistance becomes. And so what, all kinds of examples we can use. We can use Iraq, we can use Syria, we can use Afghanistan. I mean, these are all examples that Americans have been involved with fully. We're not reaching and we're not going back into the history books 200 years. We don't need to go back and talk about the guerrilla warfare that Napoleon was up against in Spain or anything like that. We have examples that we lived and we personally, and you've seen this though, because this type of understanding, because you've seen in the Biden administration at this point, hundreds upon hundreds of government officials register their complaints against this war and against the American support for this war, a war that Israel is waging that would be impossible for them to wage without American support, not just all the bombs and missiles and munitions and weapons that are provided, but also the political support, the diplomatic support, say the cover in the United Nations, the media support, right, making sure they're spun in a certain way, and the narrative of good versus evil, civilization versus barbarism, however they're expressing it, is continued. But you've seen this. You've seen 1,000 officials at the United States Agency for International Development sign a letter of protest. You've seen 400 political appointees throughout the government, political appointees of Joe Biden, throughout the government protest this. You've seen members of the staffs of Congress people and senators walk out of their offices. You've had many of them quit. You've had a high-profile resignation of a career civil servant named Josh Paul, who was the head of the State Department's office in terms of dealing with Congress and weapon sales. So a very senior guy, someone who was well-versed, understood this very well. He resigned in protest. I mean, and you've had other examples too. You've had a number of dissent cables written by members of the State Department. The State Department, in particularly Yahoo News, has been good in covering this. The State Department's had to hold meetings, listening sessions, if you will, because there's such disenchantment. There's such a feeling of disenfranchisement and disillusionment among the State Department employees who they recognize, again, not just the immorality of what's occurring here, the horror of what's occurring, but how futile and counterproductive it is. So there are plenty of people within the government who understand this, but for things that have to do with the reality of organizations, the reality of groupthink, the reality of speaking out, people are stuck. So Josh Paul, and if people are not familiar with him, look him up as we talk today. He had a great op-ed in the LA Times today, but definitely look up Josh if you're not familiar with him. But in my case, when I resigned, just to give you an example, all the same things were there. I resigned in 2009 from my position for the State Department in Afghanistan over the escalation of that war. Saw it as futile, saw it as serving no purpose, saw it as counterproductive. And when I resigned, my colleagues agreed with me. So when I sent my resignation letter in, the other political officers who were out in the provinces like I were, they agreed with me. And when I got back to the embassy, the deputy ambassador, the ambassador, folks throughout the embassy agreed with me. Richard Holbrooke, who was the special representative for Afghanistan and Pakistan for the U.S. president, agreed with me. Sent my letter to the president. So there was this tremendous agreement. And I can go on. I mean, I knew the guy who was the political advisor, the American political advisor to NATO, the NATO 4-star general. And he said when General McChrystal, who was in charge of the International Security Force in the occupation in Afghanistan, when his plan for escalating the war went around NATO headquarters in Brussels, Jack said nobody agreed with it. But when it came time to sign off on it, they all did. And, my resignation, there was a big article in the Washington Post about it, big article. And when I asked Karen DeYoung, who wrote the article, why did you do this? Why did you spend so much, print capital on me? And she said, because when I went and spoke to folks at the White House, when I spoke to folks at the State Department, the CIA, the Pentagon, no one disagreed with what you were saying. So there's this, over and over again, we see just an understanding that these wars are not just horrific, that they are cruel, that they are the costs are ungodly and unholy, but we also see an understanding that they are unwinnable, they're futile, and they're likely going to be counterproductive. They're actually going to make things worse. I think anyone who looks at, say, the American Global War on Terror knows exactly what I'm talking about. But what you have is an inability for people to resign. And there's a whole host of reasons for that. I mean, all kinds of reasons why people don't resign, whether it's the golden handcuffs. I mean, there are times, and I've been this was said to me, and other people who've resigned, like I have, say the same thing too. People say, I wish I could have done what you did, but I've got 2 kids heading to college in a couple of years. There are people who absolve themselves, say it's not my responsibility, it's above my pay grade. There are others who say, if I just stay in longer, then I can make a difference when I'm a senior person. That a whole thing might be immoral, it might be wrong, it might be counterproductive, but in the space I'm in, I can make a difference, which is just that's wrong. You couldn't be more wrong. I'll tell anyone I ever meet that's my thoughts, that, okay, I know the Iraq war is wrong. I know this is not winnable. This is a huge mistake, a huge error, but I'm going to do my part. And within my space, I will be a moral agent, which was just, I couldn't have been more wrong, because war makes you an agent of its morality, no matter how convinced that you are going to remain moral. I mean, so all these different things. And so what people do is they lie to themselves, they make excuses, they come up with rationales, and some of them are very real. But what you do have is you have this sense, this understanding within the government that the policies are wrongheaded and they're immoral, and again, counterproductive. And what you then get is you have a whole disaffected class of civil servants who don't believe in what they're doing. And this is a rot that exists within the American government, that when people talk about an American decline, about a downfall of an empire, this is something that's not very tangible. We can look and we could say, look, 60% of Americans are living paycheck to paycheck. We can talk about all the economic inequality. We could talk about the environmental and climate devastation. We could talk about these wars. We could talk about the loss of civil liberties, right? But then there are certain intangible things we can't see. And one of these is this festering rot within a government where the people who populate it don't believe in what they're doing. And it's very, very dangerous. And at some point, it will collapse.
Lloyd Austin recently was in Kiev. I want to know, what's your take on this trip? Was he trying to convince Zelensky? Was he trying to negotiate with them, to convince them, persuade them to go after negotiations? Was he there for resolving this disagreement between Zelensky and Zelensky, or he was there just announcing that US gonna support Ukraine?
I think it was a bit of all that, Nima. I think there is probably elements of all that. And David Cameron, the former former prime minister, now the foreign minister of Great Britain, he went as well. And so I think some of it was hand-holding, trying to calm and assuage anxiety and mistrust and dissension, because you've seen that. It's really kind of coming out. You see this rupture, which people had spoken about before, but now it seems very clear. I don't think you call it a rumor anymore of these differences, if you will, between Volodymyr Zelensky, the president of Ukraine, and General Zelensky, the head of the Ukrainian armed forces. And so I think there was some of an effort to try and patch that over, to maybe either softly or maybe it was done in a kind of more forceful manner, bang heads together and get these guys to knock it off. I think it was as well to reassure that the United States will get them the money. Because that is, if I was in any part of the Ukrainian establishment, I would be wide awake at night, not worried, not concerned that the Russian army is going to cross the river anytime soon. I'd be concerned that the money was going to dry out and that the whole thing was going to collapse. And not just the amount of money going in to buy bullets and fuel for tanks and artillery shells and whatnot, but the money that's being provided that supports the entire Ukrainian economy, that supports the entire Ukrainian government, that supports Ukrainian society. Right now, Ukraine is a house of cards that is kept afloat, if you will, that's kept standing by this infusion of foreign cash, very similar to Afghanistan. So the danger is that that money starts to run out, people start to panic, and that creates a collapse or precipitates a collapse, as well as then just the general functions of the government come to a halt, the economy and commerce grind to a halt. And then you could have the situation where whatever's happening on the front lines is now moot, because you've had this, you imagine just this abyss occurring, this great internal cataclysm, this collapse of all of Ukrainian society on multiple levels. Again, very similar to what we saw in Afghanistan. So the danger too is you have a Ukrainian government and society and economy that's incredibly corrupt, and it's a patronage network. And that foreign money that comes in, well, it trickles down from the top. And so what could happen if the fear of that money is present, the fear that the money is going to stop is present, people start to panic. And those who are supposed to take their cut and then push the money further down stop doing that. You'll start seeing soldiers on the front lines not getting paid. You'll start seeing vendors not being provided for the fuel and other services they need to provide to the front line, those types of things. And that's exactly what happened in Afghanistan. 6 months before the Taliban took Kabul, the Afghan army and Afghan police weren't getting fed. They weren't getting paid. They were not being resupplied. And this was even before Joe Biden made the decision that U.S. troops were going to leave Afghanistan. The fear was there that it was going to come to an end, and this corrupt pyramid scheme, if you will, the money flowing down was going to come to an end. So you might as well keep what you had, right? Because nothing more may be coming. In both Iraq and Afghanistan, I heard this phrase from Iraqis and from Afghans that we are living in the golden age. Now is the time to get the gold. And this just talks about the scale of the corruption, this fire hose of cash being pumped into these wartime nations, that are completely propped up by foreign forces, that are completely propped up by foreign money. And once that starts to evaporate, the whole thing starts collapsing like a house of cards very quickly. So Austin is there, Cameron is there. Are they there to try and make sure people don't start panicking as well? And then there's the other aspect, like you said, that as you suggested as well, Nima, the idea that maybe they are pushing, they're denying it. They just denied it again recently because the German newspaper, The Bild, had an article in the last several days talking about how the Americans and the Germans themselves too were pushing the Ukrainians to start negotiating, and they're going to deny that. The Americans, the British, the Germans, they're going to deny any such thing as happening until it's very clear it's happening. This is always the way it was when they were negotiating with the Iraqi insurgency. The same thing, denying it. Any types of this where it's so counter to the narrative and the storyline they presented as something being impossible, that it can't happen. And this is why we must continue to support, because if we don't support them, Putin and his hordes are going to march on Berlin, and then they're going to march on Paris. And, so they don't want to oppose their own narrative. They don't want to contradict themselves, because right now they're also in the process of trying to create the spin, trying to create the new narrative. If people saw about a week and a half ago, Richard Haas and Charlie Kupchan had an essay in foreign affairs, and foreign affairs in the U.S. is the preeminent foreign policy magazine. It is the magazine of the Council on Foreign Relations. And the title of this essay was Redefining Success in Ukraine. I mean, that was the title. So they are very busy right now. The White House, the National Security Council, the British Foreign Ministry, 10 Downing Street. I mean, all those folks are very busy trying to, how are we going to play this? And when we do get to the point, if we get to the point, if the Russians are so gracious, and hopefully they will be, and I think they might, to allow for a negotiation, how are we going to sell this? How are we going to now stand here and say that we negotiated with the man who was the current version of Hitler? Although they'll now try, and hopefully people are distracted because they think Hamas are the Nazis. But the idea that, you know, okay, we're going to have to get, what Joe Biden going to say? How is he going to sell this? How is he going to defend himself? And I think what they'll say is like, we stood up against, they'll just, again, redefine success, like Hassan Kupchan said. They'll move the goalposts, as we said, change the, you know, and they'll say things, like Biden will say things, Rishi Sunak will say things that we stood up to tyranny. We stopped the Russians before they could get further into Ukraine, you know, and then because we were talking about before about Hamas, very similar to NATO. What's NATO's reason for being? What's its purpose? Well, now NATO, and you can see this already, starts utilizing occupied Eastern Ukraine, as they'll call it, occupied Crimea, as their reason for being. Crimea will become the new Jerusalem, if you will, right? Recapturing Donetsk will be the purpose. This is the goal. This is what eventually we will go to. And so that gives NATO purpose that's even deeper and more meaningful than just being a shield against Russian aggression, because we have to take back something, you know. But I think they're busy doing that. And so Austin and Cameron were there, I think, possibly, as has been suggested, to say to Zelensky, Zelensky, the rest of the Ukrainian government, the time may be coming where you will have to, because this is not sustainable. You are losing. It may be an operational stalemate, but you look at your manpower situation, the fact that we can't get you artillery shells. We've given you all the tanks and infantry fighting vehicles. The F-16s are not going to make a difference. The Storm Shadow missiles did not make a difference. The HIMARS did not make a difference. The ATACMS that we gave you did not make a difference. Nothing we can give you will make a difference. And so I think maybe that was part of their visit.
Considering the dealing with these ultra-nationalists, with these neo-Nazis in Ukraine, who's going to be more successful, Zelensky or Zelensky? Do you think any of them would have a better relationship with these groups that can come to some sort of agreement with them?
I honestly don't know who would be better positioned to deal with those groups. Those groups have been strengthened. They are few in numbers. These ultra-nationalists, these far-right neo-Nazis, Banderites, as some people like to call them. You know, they have been strengthened by this because they have been proven correct, if you will, by Russia's invasion. Now, of course, there's issues with that timeline that they refer to. They leave key things out. The context isn't there. You know, they don't mention a coup in 2014, things like that. But to them, the Russian invasion proves them correct. And it might, to many Ukrainians, it says, well, okay, these people, at least we know they're on our side, because they're the ones who warned us about this. And while we didn't agree with them before, they did stand up and they did fight, on and on and on. So I think they are in a stronger position than they were previously. There are also certainly many Ukrainians who look at this and say, these are the people that dragged us into this. There was no reason for this. We could have lived in harmony. We lived in harmony. Well, I shouldn't say before, but something other than this could have been achieved. That this war was not inevitable. This war was entirely a war of choice. So there are many Ukrainians, I believe, who look at it this way. And I think most Ukrainians at this point, though, why they don't want to see their country occupied, are so exhausted, aghast, so harmed, so hurt. I mean, the number of Ukrainians who have lost family members, loved ones, neighbors, I think the number I saw was 70% knew someone who had been killed on the front lines. I mean, like, statistically, that is just an amazing number. It shows a great number of casualties. The Ukrainians may have lost an entire generation of young men if we believe what's being said, and seen this number of places. Most recently, the Time magazine article from early November on Zelensky, the one that called him messianic and delusional, that his own people were saying that, not the reporter. This is what his own people said to the reporter. But that was one of many places we've seen that the average age of the Ukrainian soldier is 43 years old. So does that mean that they have lost an entire generation of young men? You have the Ukrainian economy minister saying that Ukraine has a labor shortage of 4.5 million people. They have over 10 million people have been displaced, probably more than that, actually. Many millions of them outside the country. And with the amount of people who have been put into the army, the amount of casualties, and then all these displaced people, you have a labor shortage of 4.5 million. How is that sustainable? Particularly if you're concerned, as we were talking before, about the foreign funding, the foreign financing, that foreign prop, coming to an end. Your question, I don't know it well enough to know who would do better, Zelensky or Zelensky. Or is there someone else out there that they would rather see? But certainly that's the danger, is that as it goes forward, as collapse becomes more likely, as loss becomes more likely, if this thing is not, if there's not an attempt to control it, if there's not an attempt at a negotiated settlement to bring this to a soft landing, if you will, right? The danger then becomes that as things get worse, as things start to fragment, as the end becomes more apparent and clearer where this is headed to, you may have groups try to seize control of the government in Kyiv to direct how things are going to occur. So you may see these far-right neo-Nazi groups try and remove Zelensky from power if they fear that the collapse is coming, if they fear there's going to be a loss, if they fear that negotiations are going to occur. So again, time is of the essence here. Get negotiations now, get something that allows for these possibilities to be minimized, to be prevented, to be avoided, because again, this is all these kinds of things that's happened in our lifetime. It's not like you have to crack open the history books too far back to see examples of what we're talking about here. The great Mark Twain, history may not repeat, but it certainly does rhyme. And so all this stuff, I imagine the idea of trying to get to a point where the president of the United States is not burdened by this in his reelection campaign, because that's the most paramount thing in all of this. But then too, that it doesn't fall apart. There isn't a collapse, because a collapse too, just for 1 second on the collapse, you could have a collapse that allows the Russian armed forces to move across the river. I don't think they would, but you could try and take Odessa, try and take, maybe even Kyiv. But certainly, as they moved westward, would you then have Polish and Romanian forces moving into Ukraine to set up a buffer, right? And then you have the real danger of NATO armies coming into contact with the Russian army. That's just speculation. That's just one type of extrapolation for this. But that's where you could see the danger of a collapse having very real effects, aside from, of course, the real effects of a complete collapse of a government and its economy. Yeah, all of this, how do they get out of this? How do they avoid that from occurring while not losing more face than they already have? This is very, very difficult. And this actually almost makes the situation in Israel and Palestine seem simpler by comparison, because the United States has such great leverage over Israel. The solution to that problem is clear. You have, it's just you have the mechanisms in place through particularly the Qataris to allow for a permanent ceasefire, or to get you to the point of a permanent ceasefire. And it just really is the pressure that the Americans can put on the Israelis. So it is. But in both circumstances, as obviously you can tell, I'm not very optimistic about either other circumstances.
Politico said that Europeans are trying to buy ammunition for Ukraine from third countries. And on the other hand, the other piece says that if Trump wins, they're assuming that Trump will win. The Europeans have to offer Trump a Ukraine deal he can't refuse. When you see all these articles, do you see that Europeans are helping themselves? Do you see any strategy on their part?
I see them trying to cling to the coattails of a dying and fading empire and putting themselves in the position to go down with it, rather than having the courage to recognize the destructive nature of the American empire and to say, look, these are the American policies that brought ruination throughout the Muslim world. I'm not even going to go back that far. Let's go back to the beginning of the century. Right. We can go back further for even more examples, but this is the United States is what brought ruination and instability across the entire greater Middle East. I mean, in the greater Middle East. So from west coast of Africa all the way through Pakistan. Right. I mean, which in turn on the Europeans created a refugee crisis that they are dealing with and will be dealing with for a very long time. So just that one example should be all the reason they need to say, you know what, the Americans don't know what they're doing. They're very dangerous. We need to chart our own course. We need to follow, say, similar to what we see other nations doing, whether it's, say, like the BRICS or whatnot, and develop our own alternative mechanisms to get around American hegemony, because trying to cling on to the empire, hoping that we are going to be the most favored vassals and somehow get something out of it, it's proving it is harming us. And of course, you have the more recent examples, this war in Ukraine, the destruction of the Nord Stream pipeline. I mean, where you saw the United States, whether it was the United States directly involved or whether it was an operation run by the SBU and GUR, the Ukrainian intelligence services, but still, who were the ones who stood up, resource, those intelligence organizations? It's the Americans, and MI6 as well, the Brits as well. But so you have this deliberate act of war on a massive piece of European infrastructure, the Nord Stream pipeline. Everyone always talks about it's Russian, but yeah, it's half owned by the French and the Germans. And then what the consequence last year, in particular now as we're getting into the winter, the consequence last year of the Europeans spending about 800 billion euros, I think, in heating subsidies because of that war, because of the destruction of Nord Stream, things like that. So all these consequences that keep raining down on their head for being loyal vassals of the American empire, at some point, when are they going to have the courage to stand up and say, we're not doing this anymore? And you're starting to see that, I think with what's happening in Israel and Palestine, is providing the opportunity for some nations to begin to make that break. My grandparents were Spanish. I've never been as proud of my Spanish heritage as seeing what the Spanish, particularly some of their ministers, have been saying about Israel, have been saying about Gaza and Palestine. So maybe that is, but I think you have a cowardice that's endemic in these establishments where they are afraid to cut loose from the power that exists. Proximity to power, whether it's on an individual level, an institutional level, a national level, it's always the same thing. People become weak, people become craven, people become insipid in terms of thinking so short term because they're so afraid to lose that proximity to power. And yeah, so certainly you have foreign ministers in the European Union who are delighted because they can call the American Secretary of State and get a phone call back, right? I mean, it's like that type of proximity power we're talking about here. It's not any deeper or more complicated than that, but I think with the ascendancy of China, these other organizations like BRICS, as we were talking about, I think, we're being shown examples where it does not have to be the structure that is post-World War II, this American hegemony, this American empire. And so hopefully Europeans will have the courage to reject what is bringing them down, which is their, slavishness, their obsequiousness, their obedience to the U.S. empire.